Our next presenter, he is an explorer. He is an author. He is a rocket scientist. He is a visionary. He has explored the depths of the ocean, even down 2.5 miles to the Titanic in a French submersible. He has ventured to the Arctic North Pole on a Russian icebreaker. He is slated to join the expedition to the South Pole in a biofuel Hummers along the 1,000-mile Antarctic highway. Best of all, he is known for his trip on the Apollo 11 mission in July of 1969, where shortly after Neil Armstrong was the first human being to step on the moon. This man stepped on the moon a couple of minutes after, is the second man in history to step foot on the moon. Talk about an explorer. He has a current best-selling book, just to show you where his heart is at. It's a children's illustrated book about his life story. It's called Reaching for the Moon, and it's incredibly inspiring. Yes or yes? I want everyone to get one of these. I got one yesterday, read it right away. It was amazing. There's some music going on here or something we need to handle here. Oh, it's a construction. See, it's music to me. Anyway. And guess what? What he's doing right now, he's about to launch a series of space flight sweepstakes through his nonprofit public charity called Share Space Foundation, so that more people can actually have the experience of traveling into space. Good or good? So before we get started with them, we have a special presentation, production of the most exciting moments of the Apollo 11 journey to the moon, before we bring our next presenter to the stage. Go ahead and light it up, Tony.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Apollo 11 and gave us a magnificent ride. I'd like to trace through a little bit for you developments that have taken place in the food department. fact, on this flight, we've carried along pieces of bread. Along with the bread, we have a ham spread.
Retro, go. Vital, go. Guys, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand, go for landing, 3,000 feet. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
Same type, we're go, flight. We're
Okay,
go,
we're go.
same type, we're go. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Now I want to back up and partially close the hatch. Making sure not to lock it on my way out. That's our home for the next couple hours. We want to take good care of it. Beautiful view. Magnificent desolation. Now we'll get to the details of what's around here, but it looks like a collection of just about every variety of shape, angularity, granularity, but every variety of rock you could find.
Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
Buzz, this is Houston. You have approximately 3 minutes until you must commence your EVA termination activity. Roger, understand. Tranquility Base, Houston. You're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. We've come to the conclusion that this has been far more than 3 men on a voyage to the moon. More still than the efforts of a government and industry team. More even than the efforts of one nation. We feel that this stands as a symbol of the insatiable curiosity of all mankind to explore the unknown.
We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
little at the moon, huh? Enjoy yourself. Have fun. Woo! Thank you. Thank you. The heavens above are looking down on us. And this is why I'm here today. And I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out on such a gorgeous Colorado day. What a beautiful day this is. Didn't you like that video that my wife over here somewhere and her daughter Lisa put together? Yes, wasn't that gorgeous? Well, you can have your own private copy. That's one of the items that's on sale here. And also that this picture that you're looking at, that's going to be available autographed. And we sell those, of course. If you just notice on my shins on that picture, the little smudges, I want you to start thinking about what caused those little smudges on my shins. We'll get to that a little bit later, and if we don't, somebody better stand up and yell, "Hey, how about the smudge?" Now, I wrote a book, and it's a little windy up here, so I'm going to open up the book. And but first, I want you to see what it was like when I first began to think about the world around me, the skies above, the airplanes flying. And if you notice, I have something in my hands there at the age 2. Little did I know that about 36 years later, I'd be going around a big one called the Earth in orbit. And then a couple of years later, I'd be fortunate enough to be one of those few Americans that had a chance to go from one sphere, the Earth, to another sphere, the moon. My aviation exposure began rather early in my life. And I'm very proud of this particular picture because it's the airplane that I was flying in with my father at the controls. When I was 2 years old, he flew the family down from Newark Airport down to Miami. I proceeded to wander around exploring a little bit and got lost in the streets of Miami. But I also got exposed to the water, the big ocean, and I fell in love with the ocean years later. Now, you note that this airplane is painted like an eagle. My father was a very early aviation pioneer. He grew up in Massachusetts, and he studied very early and very young. He had short pants on, just like most of you guys out here. But he was only 15 when he graduated from high school. Then he got his master's degree from Worcester Polytech. Was a little young to get into MIT, but started in MIT, and then World War I came along, so he bootstrapped his way into flying. A Jenny was the first airplane that he flew. And he began to get to know all the early aviators. His first assignment was over in the Philippines, where he was an aide. Now I'm going to name drop a little bit here. He was an aide to Billy Mitchell. Yeah. General Billy Mitchell was later court-martialed, and he used to go through New Jersey on his way to the court in New York and bounce me on his knee. I don't think it helped too much in the decision because he managed to demonstrate to the Navy that we could sink battleships if we just didn't fly over at 20,000 feet and try and drop bombs, but we peeled off into dive bombing, and that was forbidden. So that's why he was court-martialed.
While my dad was over in the Philippines, he met two lovely sisters, daughters of an army chaplain. The older one kind of caught his fancy, and that turned out to be my mother. Now, what I want to do is, at this point, to read one of the opening pages in the book. My parents, the name my parents gave me was Edwin Eugene Jr., but the name my sister gave me was the one that would stay with me all my life. Since I was the only son, everyone in my family called me brother. But my sister, Ann, a year older than I was, could only manage to say Buzzer. Later, we got it shortened to Buzz, and no one has ever called me anything since. On summer nights, the moon hung low in the sky. That's a picture in the book of the house that I grew up in and lived in for 17 years. And I was living in that house when I had that airplane ride. On summer nights, the moon hung low in the sky, so close to our house that I thought I could reach out and touch the soft white light. I never imagined that one day I would walk on its surface, but maybe it was meant to be. You see, before she was married, my mother's last name was Moon. And the book goes on to show a picture of that airplane and a number of youthful things that I did. Athletics. I rode my bicycle to the George Washington Bridge. I was involved in athletics. I went to West Point at age 17 and graduated in 1951. From there, I went into the Air Force because there was no Air Force Academy at the time. "60 years ago, just about today, I was just like that plebe standing on the right. But that's not me, that's another person from Montclair. I'm on the left as a first classman. You notice how much straighter I'm standing up than that the plebe is. You notice the slim waistline and all that? Well, I graduated in 1951 at 21 years of age and went into pilot training and graduated in 1952. And here's a picture that was taken with my father in the back seat. Now, you don't think the Air Force was going to allow a brand new second lieutenant to take an aviation pioneer up for a ride in an airplane. No, this is what they call a photo op. Anyway, he loved the ride that he did have later on. He was a contemporary of Jimmy Doolittle's. They were both born in 1896, and they both ended up working for fuel companies, oil companies, as aviation fuel managers. After my father finished his work at MIT, he became the commandant in 1921 and 22 of the Air Corps Engineering School at McCook Field. McCook Field later became Wright Field. It's in Dayton, Ohio, and it's now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And that engineering school, through which many of the early aviators between World War I and World War II went through that school and were taught by the instructors that my father was in charge of the instructors there. So they became the leaders during World War II. My father left that position in 1928 and started working for Standard Oil New Jersey. And that's the company that owned that airplane that I had my first ride in. Now, that was a couple of years before I was born, but I had these two older sisters, and we lived in an apartment before I was born in New Jersey. But when I was coming along, they decided they needed to move into a new house in Montclair, New Jersey. By coincidence, I had dinner last night with a great friend from Montclair, New Jersey last night, and we took a picture holding up the Montclair Times, and we're going to send it back to them so they know that in Aspen, all corners of the world come together. Not only did I meet somebody from my hometown and have dinner with them, but my wife met somebody in the ladies' room who turned out to be the wife of West Pointer. And so we had a brief conversation with them also. Aspen is truly the crossroads of the world. It was about 50 years ago, I guess. No, I guess I was 50 years old that I first began to ski. When I was 50 years old, I came up here to Buttermilk and stayed with Art and Betty Pfister, and that was the first time I began to ski. I met Lois a little bit later, and we made a prenuptial before we got married. I would improve my skiing, and she would get checked out in scuba diving. I'll show you a picture of that a little bit later. Moving along in this aviation business, after graduating as a second lieutenant from pilot training, I went and trained in what the Air Force had as the best fighter pilot, the best fighter in the Air Force, the F-86 Saberjet. It was just being introduced into the Korean War in 1952. So I trained in this airplane in Las Vegas, and then went over to Korea and was involved in the Korean War for the last 6 months of the war during the year 1953. I had a number of very interesting episodes. I shot down my first MiG-15, maybe 50 miles south of the Yalu River. He was obviously on a training mission because he barely saw us coming up from behind and shooting at him, but it must have scared the bejesus out of him because he ejected the canopy, jettisoned the canopy, and then ejected himself, and my gun camera film was still working. And so as a second lieutenant, in May of 1953, I made Picture of the Week in Life magazine. Not bad for a second lieutenant. The next encounter with MiGs was a little bit scarier. I joined up with a flight in front of mine because my wingman aborted and his number 4 man aborted, and so I went up north, not even knowing who I had joined up with. Later, it turned out that they were both aces in World War II and were moving toward being an ace in the Korean War. But I didn't know who they were. They had faster airplanes. I was trying to catch up with them. It was a very, very intense mission because we were bombing the power plant at the dam on the Yalu River, the Suiho Reservoir, and the North Koreans didn't like that, neither did the Chinese. So they sent up a lot of MiGs to try and shoot down the fighter bombers. Well, we made one circle and headed straight north. Now, we weren't really supposed to be doing that, but I was still trying to catch up with the people in front of me. So when they got up to this airfield north of the river, they peeled over and started diving down, chasing some of the airplanes that were taking off. By the time I finally caught up with them, a MiG had slid in front of me, and we scissored back and forth for a while, and because the Saberjet is a little bit better performing at lower altitudes, a little faster, why, I was able to get behind him, and finally he ejected, and so I headed back south with my second kill during the Korean War. I went back to train at Las Vegas, trained in gunnery for about a year, training students. It's not an easy business. There's several students that don't quite make it for various degrees. A couple of them got killed during the training that I was there. So it's very rigorous training, but I can tell you that since 1954, in the last 30 years, the training has just tremendously increased in what we're able to do in simulating combat conditions. It's called a red flag exercise, and it's just outstanding, the kind of training our young pilots get these days. From training other pilots at Las Vegas, I went to the Air Force Academy when it first opened up, and that was in 1955. The first class came in. They didn't have any upperclassmen, so they brought in second lieutenants who had graduated from pilot training, who were graduates of the Naval Academy and of West Point. So they became the upperclassmen for 2 years, and all of those officers, even though they took a significant demotion, so to speak, for a couple of years early in their Air Force career, all of them became very outstanding leaders later on in the Air Force. The dean of faculty that I was an aide to there at the Air Force Academy was transferred out, so I stayed on about a year, and then I was transferred over to a very nice assignment in the Air Force in Germany, a place called Bitburg, Germany. And when I got over there, I recognized a good friend of mine came up to me, Ed White. Ed White was a West Pointer, graduated a year behind me. He was later killed in the Apollo fire in 1967. But back in 1956, he said, "Buzz, you've just got to get into this 22nd Fighter Squadron." So I did, and I tell you, that squadron that I was with for 3 years has more spirit to it than certainly even the astronaut corps of the people who reached the moon. From that assignment, where I was flying with Ed, and we were on the NATO gunnery team, he went back to Michigan about 2 years before I did and got his master's degree, then went through the test pilot school. That sounded like a good idea to me, and since my father had gotten a doctor's degree from MIT, I decided that that was an even more challenging place to go to. So I went back to MIT and extended my program for a 3.5-year tour for a doctor's degree. Now, what am I going to write my doctoral thesis on at MIT? Well, obviously, I knew how to intercept airplanes in the air. That appeared to me to be a very good subject, but to do that in space. And in 1960 and 61 is when I decided to write my thesis on manned rendezvous in space. Now, let me remind you what was happening during those years. In 1957, just a few months from now, it'll be 50 years ago, Sputnik flew with the Russians' launch into space, and that opened up the space age, October 4th, 1957. At the time, it didn't make a big deal to me because we were already patrolling the border, and we were transitioning over to what's called tactical fighters in Germany in 1957. And that meant we had a nuclear weapon on our wing of the airplane, and we were on 5-minute alert. And in 5 minutes, after the siren went off, we were in the cockpit, strapped in, taking off, flying low level into Czechoslovakia, into Poland, maybe just barely into the Soviet Union, Belarus, because that's about as far as we could get. But here we were, young junior officers at age 27 years old, and our mission was to deliver nuclear weapons. Now, I say that to a lot of people today because I think they seem to forget just what it was like during the Cold War when we had B-36s on alert, B-47s, B-52s, and a lot of aircraft were airborne at the time with nuclear weapons in this Cold War. Things have changed quite a bit, but we still have challenges facing this nation. And the patriots who are standing up to those challenges receive my tremendous admiration, a lot of them from the service academies. Anyway, I graduated from MIT with my doctor's degree in 1963 and was transferred to the Air Force in California. Eventually, I was part of the Air Force field office in Houston. Now, Ed White had applied for the astronaut program in 1962, and he said, Buzz, why don't you apply too? Well, I knew that I didn't have the qualifications. I hadn't been through test pilot training. So I applied anyway because I wanted NASA to know just what they might be missing. And they obviously didn't select me that year, but the next year, after my thesis was completed, I was selected in the third group of astronauts, along with Mike Collins and a number of other us. Neil Armstrong, Jim Lovell, Ed White, they were in the second group. The first group of Mercury astronauts, 7 of them, had already flown in space in 1961. 1961, Yuri Gagarin was launched into space for 1 orbit in April of 1961. Less than a month later, the best we could do with Alan Shepard was about 15 minutes of suborbital flight on a Redstone rocket. That was May 5th, 1961. Guess what? 20 days after that, after the best we could do was a small little suborbital flight, President Kennedy committed us before the end of this decade to land a man on the moon and to bring him back safely. I particularly like the last part of that phrase. So I was selected as an astronaut in 1963. We started training in 64. And the Gemini program started up with John Young and Gus Grissom flying the first spacecraft. Then Ed White, my good buddy on the track team at West Point, where we flew together in Germany. He became the first American to do a spacewalk in the Gemini 4 mission. That was after the Russian Leonov had showed us what we could do in space. So we were gradually catching up in the Gemini program, just about a mission every 2 or 3 months. It looked for a while like I wasn't going to even get to fly, not even on a rendezvous mission at all. But as fate would have it, a tragedy struck the prime crew on Gemini 9, and they needed a backup crew, so Jim Lovell and I became the backup crew for Gemini 9, and they did a spacewalk, and again, they had trouble with people getting overheated and perspiring, and they had to cancel out part of the spacewalk. But there were 2 more missions, and they also had little trouble before Jim Lovell and I would finally get to fly on Gemini 12, the last 2-man spacecraft in the Gemini program. And one of the things that I would have gotten to do, hopefully, would be to fly a backpack maneuvering unit. This picture shows me doing some training on the fairly complicated procedures of getting into the back of the spacecraft, backing into it, and then attaching the various connections so that I could cut loose the backpack and then fly around. It was fairly complex. I felt very confident that we could do it, but NASA, unfortunately, didn't want to have a partial success or a partial failure on the last Gemini mission, so they canceled the backpack, and I ended up doing a lot of real basic, simple things. There were 3 different EVAs, or spacewalks, during Gemini 12. This is a picture that Jim Lovell took of me through his front window, where I was doing a number of tasks up on the front of the spacecraft on the nose that was docked to another spacecraft that we had rendezvoused with. By this time, my name was being called Dr. Rendezvous. So each rendezvous that we did was a bit of a pressure on me to make sure that we did it properly. This is a photograph that I took during one of the spacewalks where the hatch was open and I was taking a number of pictures of night ultraviolet stars. And the last EVA was in the back of the spacecraft. And so we finished up the Gemini program, accomplishing all the 4 major objectives that would qualify us to be able to proceed into Apollo to go to the moon. The first objective was long-duration flight. Jim Lovell and Frank Borman flew 14 days together in that small, tiny spacecraft. They were rendezvoused with by Gemini 6, so that was the second major objective, from long duration to rendezvous in space. The third challenge was to use a computer to do a reentry so that we could guide the spacecraft during reentry and come back and land close to where the carrier was. And the fourth objective was to demonstrate that we understood how to do activities outside the spacecraft, which we would have to do when we landed on the moon. We'd have to go outside the spacecraft and walk around and have a backpack that would communicate with us, have the oxygen supply, the cooling water, and everything else that was needed. So that was finally demonstrated by Jim Lovell and myself on the last Apollo flight, last Gemini flight. And this shows the 2 of us after the flight on the red carpet when we came back from the carrier, that the helicopter picked us up, took us to the carrier then brought us in, and that began the end of the Gemini program. 2 months later, unfortunately, was when we had the Apollo fire. And Ed White was killed during that tragedy fire with Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee. It was only about 1.5 years later that we were able to fly Apollo 7 on a 10-day mission in Earth orbit. And that was in the fall of 1968. Now, the Russians had been doing some interesting, challenging things, and it looked to us as though they might send the cosmonaut around the moon and back before we would ever get to the moon. This was a Cold War space race, and each nation was trying to outdo the other. And because of that intelligence that led us to think that they might be able to do that, we changed the mission of Apollo 8. The lander was not ready, so Apollo 8 did not have a lander, so it was just going to fly in Earth orbit. Well, pretty soon the orbit got bigger and bigger, and Chris Kraft and the other leaders said, why not send them to the moon and have them orbit the moon? What a bold maneuver that was. The second time we flew an Apollo crew, the first time we ever put them on that big, wonderful Saturn V rocket that you saw lift off so majestically during the video. And we sent that crew to the moon. It was a very, very bold maneuver, and it really encouraged us. It saved us about 6 months. This was the end of 1968, and those of you who were alive at that time can remember the moving moments, Christmas Eve, when the crew read from Genesis. It got us in a little trouble with Madeleine Murray O'Hair, but it was a very moving moment anyway. Now, Neil Armstrong and I were on the backup crew to that flight, and it was a wondrous flight to be supporting the crew, the primary crew, because they were doing a lot of navigation exercises going route to the moon. The worst failure we felt we could have was a loss of communication. where the ground with their wonderful tracking network could not send an updated knowledge of navigation into our computer, and we'd have to do our own navigating with star to landmark sighting, star to horizon measurements. It was very tedious work to make all these measurements one after another. And once we demonstrated that we knew how to do that, we accepted the great accuracy of the Deep Space Tracking Network with its 3 big tracking stations, one in California, one in Madrid, Spain, and one in Australia. Those of you who saw the wonderful Australian film, The Dish, can remember the good Australian humor that accompanied that as they hustled around to try and get ready for the EVA that Neil and I were going to make on our first spacewalk. Well, after Apollo 8, in December of 68, we had to succeed in flying the lunar module in Earth orbit, which we did on Apollo 9. Then Apollo 10 went to the moon with the lunar lander and did everything short of slowing down and making the landing. They even got into position so that they could begin the rendezvous sequence as if they had just lifted off. This is a very challenging thing for a number of us in mission planning to try and plan missions that could come out that way. So with those 2 successful missions, the crew of Apollo 11 was assigned, and here we are with Neil Armstrong on the left, Mike Collins, who was going to fly on Apollo 8, but he had to have a back operation, so Jim Lovell took his place from our crew, and so we put Mike Collins on our crew with Neil and myself. You don't see a picture here, but let me just briefly describe the patch of the Apollo 11 crew. It showed the lunar surface with an eagle getting ready to land on the surface with the Earth in the background, and it said Apollo 11, and this was the first patch that didn't include the names of the participants. The 3 of us on the crew felt that the mission was so important that putting the names of the people up there was just superfluous. What was important was the challenge to be able to land on the moon, and the national symbol of the eagle, the name of the spacecraft that was going to land on the moon, was getting ready to land on the moon. Now, the patch looked pretty good, and so we asked some computer instructors to tell us what they thought of this patch, and one of them brilliantly said, "Why don't you have the eagle carry the olive branch of peace to the moon?" So, like the dove of peace, we put the olive branch in the beak of the eagle. So the eagle was getting ready to land on the moon, but he was too aggressive for the head of NASA in Houston, so he said, "You got to change that patch. That looks too aggressive." So obviously we took the olive branch and put it down into the claws of the eagle, which is naturally where the eagle picks up salmon with his claws as he swoops over the river. So we were kind of nature friendly, I guess, by something like that. Anyway, that's how the patch became that way. I'm sorry I don't have a picture of it here. You saw the liftoff in the video of the mighty Saturn V rocket with its 5 tremendous engines in the first stage, kerosene and oxygen, the biggest engines that had ever been built. You saw the ice that had condensed from the humid Florida air falling off the edges of the liquid oxygen. The second stage had 5 big engines. We wish we had those engines now. Matter of fact, we are going to try and develop those. The second stage, we had hydrogen engines. The Russians didn't dare to use hydrogen, but we did, and that made our rocket a little bit smaller. The Russians had a big, tremendous rocket, but they had so many engines on it that they could never successfully get it to go into orbit. And so 38 years ago, almost in 2 weeks, July 16th, 1969, we lifted off from Cape Canaveral with the hopes of getting to the moon. 1.5 orbits around the Earth, and we got the go for translunar injection, fired the rockets, and then we were on our way. We separated from the upper stage rocket when we docked with the lunar module, so we watched the upper stage rocket burn to miss the moon and to go into orbit around the sun. I'm not going to go into all the details. You're going to have to take my word for this now. But a little bit after that, we saw a UFO. Now, the UFO was one of the 4 panels that separated off when we turned around to dock with the lunar module. There was no way of tracking it to see what it was, but we could track, the ground could track the upper stage rocket, and we thought, well, you know, we're not going to, I was the one that saw this light moving against the stars, and we were not going to shake up the Earth by saying, hey, Houston, we got something following us out here. It's going along with us a little bit a ways away, but it's going to the moon with us. We weren't that stupid. So we said to them, where is the upper stage rocket? And they said, well, stand by a minute, we'll check with the back room. So when they checked with the back room and came back 10 minutes later, they said, the S4B, the Saturn upper stage, third stage rocket, was 6,000 miles away. So we figured that probably wasn't what we were looking at, so we had to satisfy ourselves with 99.9999% that this UFO was on the ground. But I tell you, it really intrigues the UFO freaks whenever I say, hey, yeah, we saw a UFO. But they don't want the details of what really happened. They just, UFO. Okay, so we get close to the moon, and I got into the lunar module and proceeded to check out, make sure it had survived the launch and was ready for us once we got into lunar orbit to get inside and to separate from the command module with Mike Collins in it. The command module was called Columbia, and the lander was called the Eagle. There's a handsome-looking young kid in there, isn't it? I've grown a little bit of hair since then, and I don't get haircuts anymore. My wife cuts my hair. That's why it looks as long as it does. The next view is a view that 24 Americans have seen personally. Many thousands and millions have seen the photographs of this stirring picture of Earthrise over the horizon of the moon. But only 24 Americans have reached the gravity field of the moon. The media and most people are only interested in the fact that 12 guys walked on the moon, but I want to assure you that 24 of us reached the moon, and that's a far bigger deal than the 450 who've just been in orbit around the Earth. And it's those people who should be remembered because they pioneered the ability to land. They brought us home. Maybe they didn't walk on the moon, but they were as much a part of those 9 missions as any of the rest of us very fortunate 12 who were able to walk on the surface of the moon. After Neil made his wonderful speech of one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, it then became my opportunity to come down the ladder and walk on the moon. Now, I didn't catch very many snickers when I said in the video, I'm going to reach back and partially close the hatch, making careful not to lock it on my way out. I tell you, if there had sprung a leak inside of oxygen and the hatch door had closed, there wasn't any way for us to get it back in again. There was no key or lock or anything, and that pressure inside would have kept us outside for eternity. Anyway, it was a little snide remark, and a little bit of humor. And now, you see me at the bottom of the ladder. Now comes the story about the smudge. It's a long ways, about 3.5 feet down to the footpad, and we decided ahead of time that when we jumped down to the footpad that was right on the surface, that we would test our ability to get back up again. Well, Neil did that very easily. He's a lot more athletic than he appears to be. Now, I was so confident when I got down to the bottom, when I jumped up, I missed. And so the dust from Neil's feet on the bottom rung of the ladder are on the shins of my suit. And that's where the smudges came from. So everybody has their little bit of trivia. I managed to get the camera away from Neil. He took most of the pictures, but I took 3 photographs that were unique. One, I photographed just the bare lunar surface. Then I put my foot down on it, and that's a classic picture. But that looked pretty lonely. So I decided to take a picture that showed the boot print and the boot that made the boot print. That's not Neil's, that's mine. I didn't get to put my name on the boot, but anyway, the lunar surface is such fine talcum powder, and it's probably 15, 20 feet deep, just all churned up from many, many impacts on the moon. And those impacts melted the moon and caused the little particles to go out, and then they would solidify so that when they would hit the ground, hit the surface again, they would fracture. And so the dust consists of lots of pieces of glass, little fine dust glass particles. And there's no air up there, so that when it gets pretty peppered a good bit, why, it tends to settle it down. So there are no air molecules between these dust particles. So when you get down an inch or two, it's very, very compact. And it's very hard to put the flag in and other things. We see some of the experiments that we put out there. In the background, you can see the flag, and also back near the spacecraft, there's a Swiss experiment that was put out sort of like a window shade, maybe 3 or 4 feet long, and it was collecting particles that for the 2 hours were coming from the sun. The sun emits the solar wind continuously for billions and billions of years, and it impacts on the surface of the moon. It never reaches the Earth because of the atmosphere and because of the radiation belts. But we had this experiment that was sort of like a window shade, and it, when we brought it back, could tell the Swiss experimenters just how many particles came from the sun. Now, the experiment that's in the foreground is a seismometer, and you pull little levers and it sort of unfolded itself out. And the experimenter said, now after you expose the solar panels to the sun, where it can rise, in this case it rises to the right of the screen and goes over to the left for 14 days of daylight and 14 days of darkness. And the experimenter said, don't walk in front of the panel because you'll interrupt the electricity going to the seismometer. Well, if you look very, very carefully, you can see some footprints just to the right of that experiment. And that's what the legal guys today call condemning evidence. That old Buzz walked in front of that panel after it had been deployed. So that's one of the reasons I want people to get back to the moon, so they can erase some of that condemning evidence. Now, I got paper clips up here to prepare me for this brisk wind, so that's why it takes a little bit of time. The next picture really is a classic of patriotism. Can you imagine the feeling that an American military person has standing next to the American flag and being able to salute it. The flag stands out at about 90 degrees, and you wonder, geez, how did you guys do that? Well, the rod that held the flag up locked into position 90 degrees, but it was supposed to telescope, but it was frozen, and it didn't telescope, so it was kind of ruffled there, so we had to spread it out some to make it look like it was in a breeze. And even though when we lifted off, the exhaust of the AsicBitmain engine blew the flags over, you saw the force of that during the video film, but we didn't want to tell anyone that our flag blew over right away. We waited about 10 years later. But there's no doubt that of all the 6 flags on the 6 landing sites on the moon, that Apollo 11 has the best looking flag. Now, we had a lot of things to do. We got back in the spacecraft, tried to sleep. It got cold as could be. We turned up the heat as much as we could, but we had vented oxygen into the cabin twice. Once after we disconnected so we could throw over the backpacks and other things to lighten the weight of the liftoff. And the second time, we had to close the hatch and put oxygen back in again. So twice it had cooling oxygen in there, and we had a little bit of trouble sleeping that night. But we got up and I found a broken circuit breaker. It turned out to be the engine arm circuit breaker that had broken off. So we told Houston about that, and they had about 6 hours to figure out what they could do if we couldn't get that circuit breaker to stay in. But it did, and we lifted off, and of course Dr. Rendezvous had to do all of his good work in addition to all the good information we had from the onboard computer and the tracking network. And we left the moon, pictures taken of the moon as we left, and then we re-entered at about 5.5, 6 Gs, and we landed in the Pacific Ocean. We were taken from that spacecraft, and we put on these suits and to protect the germs that we might have picked up, to protect you people from the germs. We had already been exposed to them, of course. We were inside the trailer, this little trailer that's to the right of the screen, and while we were in there, the flight surgeon came in and said, while the President and the Navy were getting their act together, said, would you like to see some film, TV film of what the reaction was on Earth when you guys landed? And they showed us pictures of London and Paris and Washington, all the crowds cheering, and I just couldn't resist. Here we were, very busy at that moment on the lunar surface, and now we're on the trailer, and we're seeing what happened 5 days earlier back in the States. And I couldn't resist tapping Neil on the shoulder and saying, Neil, hey, look up there. We missed the whole thing. Yeah, we missed because we were out of town when you guys were cheering their success. Well, the 3 of us were back on the carrier, Mike with his mustache, and we were still in quarantine. We stayed in quarantine for 21 days since we left the moon, and then we were involved in a 45-day round trip around the Earth, meeting kings and queens and all sorts of people. It was not exactly what I had bargained for. The changes that had happened during the letdown somewhat of what do I do next after I've been to the moon. I went back to the Air Force and commanded the test pilot school for a time, but that really wasn't too satisfying. I didn't tell you earlier that I had depression and suicide in my family. My grandfather had committed suicide on my mother's side, and she'd committed suicide a year before our flight to the moon. So the thing was family, and became somewhat prey to that depression, and alcoholism was mixed to it, and I went into treatment and now have 28 years of sobriety, probably. Probably one of the toughest things that I've done, but also one of the most satisfying. A little bit later, one of the more satisfying things came along when my domestic life sort of came apart, and I was beginning to put my life back together again, and I met that lovely lady, Lois Driggs from Phoenix, and we got married. It'll be 20 years this next Valentine's Day. So, despite the fact that I lost about 10 years of effectiveness at age 50, 55, or 45, 50, I've stayed with the space program, and we have a wonderful, rewarding life now. We have a family of, I have 3 children in different parts of the world, and she has 3 children, but we have 2 cats. And the 2 cats look more and more like us every day. I've helped out in substance abuse programs, testifying to Congress, to the Senate, along with Carol O'Connor and Senator Max Cleland. I started scuba diving, as I mentioned earlier, in 1957, 50 years ago. Lois and I had this prenuptial that I would improve my skiing after age 50, and she would get checked out in scuba diving, which she's done. And so now we ski and we scuba dive in different parts of the world. As was mentioned earlier, I had another opportunity to do something a little bit more spectacular than scuba diving. Not only did I wear this yellow jacket, but I was in a yellow submarine with 2 Frenchmen, and we went down to see, the next slide, the Titanic. And I tell you, that's over 2 miles of water, and you just think about an hour and a half sinking down to the bottom slowly, and all of this water, black as could be. That's a lot of water. Even though on the surface of the globe of the Earth, it's a pretty thin little layer. It's pretty deep. So I decided I had to do a few other things. So I got to the North Pole with a Russian nuclear icebreaker. I decided to take up car racing once in the Long Beach Grand Prix, and I didn't finish first, but I did finish, and it was a great experience. I've written a good number of books since I've been back. My most satisfying to me is the science fiction story Encounter with Tiber, where aliens from Alpha Centauri came here to the Earth 6,000 years or 9,000 years ago. Since then, I wrote the children's book that you've seen earlier, and it shows a number of aspects of my life. It's been so successful, and what it really does is it takes a very, very lucky, in the right place at the right time, historical figure on a pedestal and brings him down to earth so that young kids can see that the things that I did as a young kid are the same kind of challenges that they face. Riding their bicycle, learning how to swim, getting involved in athletics, letting education move them along in earth. It is really education that has gotten me to where I am in life. And because of that, I've participated in the Buzz Aldrin Elementary School near Dulles Airport in Virginia. It's been in existence 10 years now. I formed a nonprofit that's called the ShareSpace Foundation, and it's that foundation that is the beneficiary of some of your donations here. There are T-shirts available for certain donations. ShareSpace really performs in 3 areas. Experiences like that for fortunate people who put up $50, $100 instead of $200,000 or $20 million to fly into space. So they have experiences. We help their education programs, starting in the state of California, with helping out each congressional district improve the education qualities for the parents of the congressional district. And the third E is exploration. We want to support, especially in approaching election years, the exploration programs of NASA's. We want to do that by pointing out the benefits that were derived by exploration in the past, by celebrating the 40th anniversaries. So about a year from now, we'll be catching up with Mercury, Gemini, and overall Apollo. Then we'll group together Apollo 7 and 8 in October of '08, just before the election. I want to remind you that it's the person in the White House that determines the direction of our space program. And we've had 2 terms now that have reoriented our program in a particular way, away from just going into low Earth orbit with a laboratory. We're moving away from that into returning to exploration, returning to the moon, and onto Mars. Along with that exploration and those 40th anniversaries, talking about the past and the future, we have a good bit of tourism in space. Now, this is a very idealistic view of a big space hotel that might be rotating around. That's probably 30, 40, maybe 50 years off in the future. But we are starting with suborbital flights, and BIռT Rutan, with the help of Paul Allen's finances, put together a demonstration with the White Knight 1 and the Spaceship 1, shown in this slide, designed by BIռT Rutan, financed by Paul Allen, and licensed now to Richard Branson, and a much larger White Knight 2 will carry aloft a Spaceship 2, which will take 6 passengers and a crew of 2 into space. I was at one of the early test flights of this Spaceship 1, and here I'm shown congratulating Mike Melville and his successful first flight. The other thing that's been happening recently are zero-gravity flights. I've flown in 5 zero-gravity flights in 727 aircraft, which give you an exposure to Mars gravity, which is about 1/3 of what we have on Earth, lunar gravity, 1/6 of what we have, and then several flights, 8 or 10 flights of zero gravity, where everyone is floating around. And this is where it shows me floating around, experiencing zero gravity again. It's a very exhilarating experience, and we're going to have prizes for this experience as part of the lottery, share space, sweepstakes, whatever you might want to call it. We'll come up with a name, but we hope for this to be in effect before the year is out, so people for a contribution of $50 or $100 may be able to take a chance on being able to get into zero-gravity flight, eventually suborbital flight, and hopefully, when this expands beyond limited space advocacy groups to the public at large, we'll have this, the prizes will be flights into orbit. The primary purpose is to educate our young people by having them share experiences just to see what space flight is like. My group of engineers have been involved in designing the booster rockets that are reusable, that come back and land on a runway, and the spacecraft that can take people into orbit. We hope that one day some of the designs we've been working on will be a part of what we're available to do. We will maybe have something like the Lunar Olympics, and since I was a pole vaulter, I'd be very interested to see just how high somebody could pole vault in the lunar gravity. I've helped to develop strategies of getting to Mars with Mars Cycler spacecraft that are continuously in motion between the Earth and Mars. We will land people on Mars, maybe 2030, maybe 2035. The Hubble telescope is taking some marvelous pictures for us. And the last picture I want to show while I take you on a quick imaginary trip is of the neighboring galaxy to us, Andromeda. It's about the same size as our Milky Way galaxy, but it's about 20 times the diameter away. So it's over 1 million light years away. The diameter of our galaxy, which looks like this, is 100,000 light years in diameter. And just to travel 100 light years away would take, at half the speed of light, would take us 200 years to get there. Traveling real close to the speed of light, relativity takes in, and that doesn't help too much. Imagine that you're in a classroom or a lecture hall in a city on a planet that's 26 light years from Earth in the planetary system of the summer star Vega that was featured in Carl Sagan's movie Contact. Now, the year I'm taking you to is 2507, and your instructor is identifying on a hologram the original world of the human race. He points to Sol, and then he focuses on the third planet from the sun, the Earth, a brilliant jewel of a world with a magnificent moon, no longer a desolate moon, but now inhabited with industry. It's almost a twin planet system. The beauty of these rejuvenated worlds takes your breath away. Your instructor continues to speak. It was only 5 centuries ago that humanity first stepped off the planet Earth and onto another world. That world was the Earth's only moon, and looking back, the step seems to be a small one. Only 240,000 miles, just a little over what light travels in 1 second. But remember, until that time, humanity was not able to leave the Earth. It didn't have the knowledge or the means. That moment was a most important moment in our history, the time when it became possible to explore beyond the surface of that single planet, to realize our destiny of sending life to cold and empty worlds. What a time to have been alive. What I wouldn't give to have been alive there on Earth at that time. Just think of the adventure, the vision, the sense of destiny that surely must exist when humanity first set foot on another world to explore, and then, after a brief wait, to venture outward again to settle the universe. Now, those are the thoughts and feelings that countless future generations will have as they think back to the second half of the 20th century. As Mecca is to the Muslim and Jerusalem is to many Christians and Jews, so the earth may become the future generation of humanity, the place from which origins or the genesis. You are here at that very history, and this is the beginning. Thank you.